Mark had always loved the calm mornings by the lake. The sun would just begin to rise, casting a golden glow across the water, and the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore was the perfect way to start the day. From his deck, he could see the reflection of the trees lining the opposite bank, and occasionally a heron would lift gracefully into the sky, its wings spreading wide. Life in the lakefront community had always been quiet, orderly, and peaceful, and Mark liked it that way. He appreciated the well-kept homes, the trimmed lawns, and the sense that everyone took care of their property. Fishing was Mark's favorite pastime. It wasn't just about catching fish. It was about the quiet moments of reflection, the patience it required, and the satisfaction of being in tune with nature. On most mornings, he would walk down to the water, rod in hand, and find a spot near the edge of his property to cast his line. Sometimes neighbors would wave as they jogged along the paths, and he would nod back politely. Everything felt simple and predictable, just the way he liked it. But even in the most serene communities, rules mattered. Mark had always known that. The Homeowners Association prided itself on being strict with regulations, though he had rarely felt the impact of them personally. He followed the rules when it came to lawn care, parking, and general upkeep. Fishing, however, had always seemed like a private activity on his own property, something no one would question. That sense of security began to shift one crisp morning in late spring. Mark was sipping his coffee when a letter arrived in his mailbox, stamped with the association's official seal. Curious, he opened it. His heart sank as he read the words printed on the page. He had been fined $3,200 for fishing without a permit in the community lake. $3,200. The amount seemed unreal, almost like a mistake. He read the letter again, but the words remained. The fine was valid, and the board expected payment. Mark sat down heavily on the edge of his deck, staring at the letter. How could this be? He had fished in that spot countless times before. He had never been warned, never asked to pay for a permit, and certainly never thought of the lake as anything but part of his property view. The idea that a leisurely morning activity could cost him thousands of dollars was bewildering. He decided to act immediately. He called the association office and asked to speak with someone who could explain the situation. On the other end of the line, a polite but firm voice outlined the regulations. The lake was technically community property, and all residents needed a permit to fish. The rules had been in place for years, though Mark had never been made aware of them. No exceptions could be made. The conversation ended with a polite but non-negotiable statement. The fine stood, and failure to pay would result in further action. Mark felt a mix of disbelief and frustration. He wasn't the type to cause trouble, but this felt unjust. It wasn't about the money alone, it was about principle. How could something so trivial escalate into such a large punishment without prior warning? He spent the rest of the morning reviewing the community guidelines, searching for anything that might help him understand why he had been singled out. The rules were dense, full of legalese, and sometimes contradictory. The more he read, the more he realized that there were inconsistencies, and perhaps even an oversight on the part of the board. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Mark's initial shock gave way to a quiet determination. He wasn't going to ignore this fine, but he also knew that challenging the association would not be simple. There would be resistance, questions, and probably a lot of tension with his neighbors. Yet he also recognized that he couldn't allow an unfair penalty to stand without a fight. That evening he sat on his deck again, rod propped against the railing, and looked out at the lake. The reflection of the trees shimmered in the water, and for a moment the world seemed calm again. But Mark knew that this peace was fragile. Something had shifted in the community and in himself. What had been a simple, quiet life by the lake was about to become far more complicated. The first chapter of a struggle over fairness, property, and principle was only just beginning, and Mark realized that he had to be ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Mark woke with a sense of unease. The letter from the Homeowners Association still lay on the kitchen counter, a constant reminder of the fine that threatened to disrupt his life. $3,200 was not a trivial amount, and although Mark had a stable job and had saved carefully over the years, the fine felt like an unnecessary and unfair blow. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stared out the window at the lake, trying to find calm in the familiar scene. It seemed almost absurd that a simple pastime like fishing could turn into such a costly problem. Mark knew he had to act quickly. He decided to attend the next HOA board meeting to present his case in person. He carefully read through the community rules again, highlighting sections that seemed unclear or contradictory. There were mentions of permits, yes, but nowhere had he ever received notification that fishing on the lake required such paperwork. In his mind, the lake had always been an extension of his property's edge, a natural part of the environment he had been allowed to enjoy for years. When the day of the board meeting arrived, Mark dressed in his usual casual attire and tried to calm his nerves. The community center was already filled with residents, some chatting politely, others exchanging hushed whispers. Mark could feel the tension in the air, a subtle undercurrent that suggested that this meeting was about more than routine matters. As he took a seat near the back, he noticed the board members seated at the front of the room, expressions carefully neutral, hands folded, papers organized neatly before them. The meeting began with the usual announcements about community upkeep, landscaping schedules, and upcoming events. Then came the moment Mark had been waiting for, the discussion of his fine. The board president, a composed woman named Ms., outlined the reason for the $3,200 fine. She emphasized that the rules had been in place for years and that they were designed to protect the lake's ecosystem and ensure fairness among residents. There was no room for exceptions. Mark raised his hand and, when recognized, spoke calmly but firmly. He explained that he had never received notice of the permit requirement and that he had always assumed the lake was accessible to residents along their property lines. He had never intended to break any rules and had been unaware of any wrongdoing. He asked the board to consider reducing or rescinding the fine. Ms. listened patiently, nodding occasionally, but when she responded, her tone was firm. The rules, she said, applied to everyone equally, and the board had no authority to waive fines for individual residents. Other board members echoed her points, emphasizing consistency and the importance of maintaining order in the community. Mark realized that reasoning with them was unlikely to succeed. The fine was more than a simple reprimand. It was a statement about authority and control. After the meeting, Mark spoke with a few neighbors in the hallway. Some offered sympathy, quietly admitting that the fine seemed excessive, while others shook their heads, suggesting that he should have checked the rules more carefully. The mix of opinions left him unsettled. He knew he had support, but he also recognized that he was now facing an uphill battle, not just with the HOA, but with community perceptions as well. Over the next few days, Mark spent hours reviewing the HOA documents and researching similar cases. He discovered instances where rules had been enforced inconsistently, and in some cases, fines had been reduced after disputes. Armed with this information, he began to formulate a plan for challenging the fine. He would not simply pay it and move on. He intended to defend himself and, if necessary, take legal action to ensure that his rights as a homeowner were respected. The situation weighed heavily on him. Fishing, once a peaceful escape, now felt like a symbol of conflict and frustration. Every morning as he walked along the edge of his property, he glanced at the lake with a mix of longing and unease. He could no longer enjoy it without thinking about the looming fine and the board's rigid stance. Yet deep down, a spark of determination grew. He was not going to let a single letter dictate how he lived his life or take away something he had cherished for years. By the end of the week, Mark had made a decision. He would fight the fine, challenge the board, and protect his right to enjoy his property. It would not be easy, and he knew the road ahead would be fraught with tension and resistance, but he also understood that sometimes standing up for oneself required courage, persistence, and careful planning. The first step had been taken, and Mark felt a mix of apprehension and resolve. The calm days by the lake might be behind him for now, but he was determined to reclaim them on his own terms. Word of Mark's fine spread quickly through the neighborhood, and the calm lakefront community suddenly felt charged with tension. What had once been quiet conversations over garden fences or at weekend barbecues now carried an undercurrent of curiosity and opinion. Some neighbors approached Mark with sympathetic smiles, quietly expressing that the fine seemed excessive and that the rules had been applied unfairly. Others, however, sided firmly with the homeowners association, insisting that rules existed for a reason and that everyone should be held to the same standard. The simple act of fishing, once private and peaceful, had become a topic of community debate. Mark felt the weight of these differing opinions keenly. He had never considered himself confrontational, yet here he was, standing at the center of a dispute that had the potential to divide his neighbors. He walked along the paths by the lake more cautiously now, noticing small looks, whispered comments, and a subtle shift in the way people greeted him. The community that had once felt welcoming and calm now seemed wary, as if they were waiting to see how this conflict would unfold. Determined to protect his rights, Mark began a careful review of the community bylaws and documents. He looked for clarity, for anything that might support his case, and what he found surprised him. There were inconsistencies in how rules had been enforced in the past, and in some cases, fines had been reduced or even waived under similar circumstances. These discoveries gave Mark a sense of hope. While the fine itself was daunting, he realized that there were legal and procedural avenues that could work in his favor. Mark also reached out to a few neighbors he trusted for informal advice. One neighbor, an experienced lawyer who lived a few streets over, suggested that Mark document everything: letters, notices, dates, conversations, and carefully prepare a written record of events. Another neighbor who had once challenged a minor HOA dispute successfully encouraged him to remain calm and professional, even as tensions rose. These conversations reassured Mark that he was not entirely alone, and that there were people who valued fairness over blind rule enforcement. Despite the support, Mark could feel the pressure mounting. The board had been firm and unwavering in its decision, and the threat of further legal action loomed over him. He began to think more strategically. Paying the fine outright would end the immediate problem, but it would also set a precedent that he believed was unjust. Challenging it meant committing time, energy, and potentially money, but it also offered the chance to protect not only his own rights, but also the principle of fairness for other residents in the future. As he pondered his options, Mark noticed subtle changes in the lake itself. Where he had once walked freely along the shoreline, he now felt a sense of caution, as if the very water reflected the uncertainty in the community. Fishing, which had been a source of relaxation, now carried a tinge of anxiety. He sometimes paused mid-cast, watching families and neighbors enjoying the lake from a distance, wondering what they thought of the fine and whether his actions were creating division. By midweek, Mark had decided that he would prepare a formal challenge to the fine. He began drafting letters to the board, outlining his understanding of the rules, citing inconsistencies, and requesting a reconsideration. Each sentence was carefully chosen, professional in tone, and focused on facts rather than emotion. He knew that any hint of anger or resentment could undermine his case. At the same time, he started gathering documents, photographs, and any records that could help support his position in a potential legal proceeding. Evenings were now spent at his desk rather than by the water, with the gentle hum of the lake in the background serving as a reminder of what was at stake. Mark reflected on the changes in his community, recognizing that the conflict had revealed underlying tensions he had never noticed before. Some neighbors valued rules above all else, while others were more concerned with fairness and common sense. Mark understood that navigating this situation required not only knowledge of the rules, but also patience, strategy, and resilience. By the end of the week, Mark had a clear plan of action. He would formally challenge the fine, document every interaction, and prepare for the possibility of legal proceedings. The peaceful days he had enjoyed by the lake might not return immediately, but he felt a growing determination to reclaim them. The fine was no longer just a financial burden. It had become a catalyst for standing up for his rights and principles. Mark knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but he also understood that it was one he had to take if he wanted to protect both his property and his peace of mind. After a few weeks of preparation, Mark realized that he needed to take a more concrete step. He had tried reasoning, researching, and gathering evidence, but the homeowners association had been unwavering. The fine remained, and the board showed no signs of reconsidering. While he had initially hoped for a peaceful resolution, it was becoming clear that the situation would not resolve itself. Mark decided it was time to assert his rights in a way that was both legal and unmistakable. He began planning the construction of a fence along the edge of his property that bordered the lake. The fence would not block the entire lake or prevent general access, It would simply mark the boundary of his land and establish a clear separation between his private property and the communal areas. To Mark, this was a reasonable and measured action. It was not intended to provoke anyone, but to protect his interests and reinforce that his property rights mattered. Over the course of several days, Mark researched materials, measurements, and designs. He wanted the fence to be sturdy, visually unobtrusive, and in keeping with the community's aesthetic. He considered the opinions of neighbors who valued the appearance of the neighborhood and decided on a natural wood finish that blended with the surroundings. He also ensured that the fence would comply with all building regulations and HOA specifications for construction, leaving no room for accusations of illegality. When the construction began, curious neighbors stopped by to watch. Some asked questions politely, others exchanged quiet comments among themselves. A few expressed concern, suggesting that the fence might escalate tensions with the HOA. Mark explained his intentions calmly. The fence was meant to mark his property and protect his access to the lake, nothing more. He emphasized that he was following the rules and taking all necessary precautions. Despite these explanations, the fence quickly became a symbol in the neighborhood. People debated its necessity, its appearance, and its implications. Some sympathized with Mark, admiring his initiative and understanding that he was defending his rights. Others viewed it as a challenge to the board's authority, interpreting the fence as a provocation rather than a boundary. Mark understood that perception mattered as much as legality, but he remained focused on the principle of his actions rather than the opinions swirling around him. As the final posts were set and the wooden panels secured, the fence stood as a clear and firm boundary. For Mark, it was a relief. It represented not just a physical marker of his property, but also a mental milestone in his journey. The act of building it had given him a sense of control in a situation that had felt increasingly unfair. He could once again enjoy his mornings by the lake, though now with an awareness that his actions had shifted the dynamics in the community. The homeowners association quickly took notice. Board members visited the site and measured the construction against community guidelines. They exchanged emails and letters, noting that while the fence technically with property boundaries, it also restricted access to areas that some residents had previously used informally. This set the stage for further conflict. The HOA viewed Mark's action as a challenge to their authority, while Mark viewed it as an assertion of rights that had been ignored for too long. Mark's interactions with neighbors also evolved during this period. Some approached him with quiet encouragement, offering help or simply expressing support. Others remained distant, wary of taking sides or attracting attention from the board. Mark learned to navigate these conversations carefully, maintaining courtesy and neutrality while protecting his position. He realized that the conflict had grown beyond a simple fine. It had become a matter of principle, community perception, and personal integrity. Evenings after the construction were quieter than before. Mark would sit on his porch, looking out at the fence and the lake beyond. The water still shimmered under the setting sun, and the sounds of nature remained, but the sense of peace was tempered by awareness of the tensions that now existed. The fence was more than wood and nails. It was a statement that Mark would not allow arbitrary rules to dictate his enjoyment of his property. He knew that the homeowners association would respond, possibly with legal action, but he also felt a sense of empowerment. The next phase of the conflict had begun, and Mark was ready to face it with careful planning, patience, and resolve. In building the fence, Mark had turned a passive struggle into a visible and tangible action. It marked a clear line, both physically and metaphorically, between submission and assertion, between frustration and determination. He had no illusions about the road ahead, but he felt confident that he had taken a necessary step toward protecting his home, his rights, and his peace of mind. The calm lakefront mornings had changed, but for the first time since receiving the fine, Mark felt that he was steering the course of his own destiny. It did not take long for the homeowners association to respond to the fence. Within days of its completion, Mark received a formal letter from the board. The tone was polite but firm, outlining that the construction, while within his property boundary, had restricted access to areas that the community considered shared space. The letter stated that the board intended to pursue legal action unless a resolution could be reached. Mark read the letter carefully, noting every word. The homeowners association was clearly escalating the situation. What had started as a fine for fishing had now turned into a dispute over property boundaries, community rules, and perceived access rights. He felt the weight of the situation pressing on him, but he also felt a growing determination. He had acted within his rights, and he was ready to defend them. He contacted a lawyer he had researched earlier, a professional familiar with property disputes and community association law. The attorney explained the process calmly, outlining the potential steps the HOA could take, the likely defenses, and the documentation that would be necessary. They discussed the importance of maintaining a record of communications, photographs of the property and fence, and evidence showing that the fence was both legal and reasonable. Mark left the office feeling more prepared, though he also understood that the upcoming legal proceedings would be time-consuming and potentially stressful. Meanwhile, word of the dispute spread further through the neighborhood. Some residents came to Mark's home to offer support, bringing small gestures like coffee or words of encouragement. Others avoided him entirely, unsure how to navigate a situation that was rapidly becoming the central topic of community discussion. The lake, once a symbol of peaceful mornings and quiet afternoons, now felt like a contested space. Mark found himself walking along the edge of his property with a heightened awareness, noting how neighbors looked at the fence and the way people whispered when they passed by. Mark's days quickly filled with preparation. He met with his attorney multiple times to review correspondence from the HOA, draft formal responses, and plan a strategy for court if necessary. Every email, letter, and note from the HOA was meticulously saved, creating a detailed record of the interactions that had led to this point. He also took photographs of the fence from multiple angles, noting distances and measurements, to provide clear evidence that the construction was within his rights. Even as he focused on these practical matters, Mark felt the emotional toll. He had once looked forward to mornings by the lake with anticipation, but now each visit was accompanied by a sense of caution. The peaceful environment he had cherished had transformed into a space of tension, uncertainty, and subtle judgment. Yet he remained committed to his course, understanding that standing up for oneself often required facing discomfort and challenge. Neighbors' reactions were varied and unpredictable. Some voiced concerns that the dispute might escalate further, possibly involving lawyers, court dates, and additional fines. Others quietly acknowledged that the fine had seemed unfair from the start, and that Mark had every right to take measured action to protect his property. These interactions reminded him that the community was not monolithic. There were differing perspectives, and part of the challenge was navigating these social dynamics while staying focused on his legal and personal objectives. As the week progressed, Mark and his attorney began drafting a formal response to the HOA's complaint. The letter emphasized that the fence was built within his property boundaries, with all applicable rules, and did not constitute an illegal restriction of access. They highlighted the inconsistencies in the HOA's previous enforcement of rules, making the case that the fine and subsequent threats lacked sufficient legal or procedural basis. Mark reviewed the letter carefully, ensuring that it communicated firmness without hostility, clarity without aggression. By the end of the week, Mark felt a mixture of apprehension and resolve. The fence had become a symbol of his determination to assert his rights, and the formal response marked a significant step in the ongoing dispute. He knew that the homeowners association might escalate further, possibly taking the matter to court, but he also felt confident in his preparation. The peaceful lakefront mornings he had once taken for granted were now intertwined with a sense of responsibility, strategy, and courage. Sitting on his porch one evening, Mark gazed at the fence and the lake beyond, reflecting on how far he had come in a matter of weeks. The legal threat from the HOA had transformed his life in subtle but profound ways. He had learned to document, to strategize, and to stand firm in the face of opposition. The conflict was far from over, but for the first time since receiving the fine, he felt a growing sense of control. The lake remained as beautiful as ever, but now it was also a reminder of resilience, preparation, and the quiet power of standing up for what was right. Mark knew that the next steps would require careful planning and patience. The homeowners association had made it clear that they intended to pursue legal action, and the prospect of a courtroom battle was both daunting and necessary. He spent the early mornings walking along the edge of his property, observing the fence he had built and the lake beyond, thinking strategically about how to approach the conflict. The fence was no longer just a physical barrier. It had become a symbol of his resolve, and he understood that every detail mattered. He met frequently with his attorney to discuss strategy. They went over the HOA's complaints line by line, analyzing the language and identifying weaknesses in their arguments. Mark learned that many community rules were subject to interpretation, and past instances of inconsistent enforcement could work in his favor. They discussed legal precedents and the importance of focusing on facts rather than emotion. Mark found these discussions empowering, as they turned his frustration into actionable steps. Documentation became a daily routine. Mark meticulously recorded every interaction with the HOA, noting dates, times, and the content of conversations. He cataloged emails and letters, took detailed measurements of the fence, and photographed the property from multiple angles to show compliance with community regulations. Every detail mattered, and he took care to be thorough. The process was time-consuming, but it gave him confidence that he could present a strong, well-supported case if the situation reached court. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the community continued to shift. Neighbors watched the unfolding dispute with interest, curiosity, and in some cases, apprehension. Some quietly expressed support for Mark, admiring his determination and patience. Others remained cautious, wary of attracting attention from the HOA or being drawn into the conflict. Social interactions became more measured, with subtle shifts in greetings, glances, and conversations. Mark learned to navigate these dynamics carefully, maintaining cordial relationships while asserting his position. As preparation for a potential legal challenge intensified, Mark also considered ways to de-escalate tensions without compromising his rights. He explored options such as mediation or informal discussions with the board, hoping to find a resolution that respected both parties' interests. However, he remained realistic. The HOA had already demonstrated a strict and uncompromising approach. While he remained open to dialogue, he was prepared for the possibility that the matter would have to be resolved in court. Evenings were often spent reviewing documents, drafting notes, or consulting with his attorney. Mark noticed how the dispute had subtly changed his daily routine. Where once he had spent hours fishing and enjoying the quiet serenity of the lake, now his thoughts were frequently occupied with strategy, rules, and potential outcomes. Yet, despite the added stress, he felt a growing sense of purpose. This was more than a personal dispute. It was a test of patience, resilience, and careful planning. Mark also began to consider the wider implications of his actions. If he succeeded in challenging the HOA, it could set a precedent that might benefit other residents in the future. He realized that standing up for his rights was not just about the fence, the fine, or the lake. It was about fairness, clarity, and ensuring that rules were applied consistently. This understanding strengthened his resolve, turning frustration into motivation. As the trial date approached, Mark and his attorney conducted mock sessions to practice responses and anticipate questions. They reviewed community bylaws and gathered evidence from past HOA actions, building a comprehensive defense. Mark focused on staying calm and composed, knowing that professionalism would be critical in presenting his case. Every detail, every document, and every interaction was carefully considered to ensure that he could demonstrate both compliance and reasonableness. By the time the first formal pre-trial discussions took place, Mark felt prepared. He had turned a stressful and confusing situation into a carefully organized defense. The fence remained as a visible reminder of his assertion of property rights, and the lake continued to reflect the early morning light, offering him a sense of calm amid the tension. Mark knew that the outcome was uncertain, but he also understood that he had taken every step possible to protect his home, his rights, and his peace of mind. The weeks of preparation had taught him lessons he could never have anticipated. Patience, persistence, and thoroughness became his guiding principles. He had transformed frustration into strategy and worry into determination. The conflict with the HOA was far from over, but Mark felt confident that he could face whatever came next with clarity, courage, and careful planning. The calm mornings by the lake had returned in part, not in leisure but in focus, as he prepared to defend what was rightfully his. The morning of the trial arrived with a sense of anticipation that Mark had not experienced in years. The courthouse was busy with unrelated cases, but in the small conference room reserved for community disputes, there was a quiet tension. Mark felt a mixture of nerves and resolve. He had prepared meticulously with his attorney, but facing the board and presenting his case in front of a judge was different from reviewing documents in his living room. The stakes felt higher than ever. The Homeowners Association was represented by their own attorney, a formal and composed professional who seemed confident in the strength of the board's position. They presented their case first, emphasizing the importance of following community rules, protecting shared spaces, and maintaining fairness for all residents. The board members were polite but firm, their testimony precise and rehearsed. They described the fine, the perceived impact of the fence on access, and their belief that rules were meant to be enforced without exception. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he took a deep breath and focused on clarity. He emphasized that the fence had been constructed entirely within his property boundaries and with all applicable guidelines. He presented photographs, measurements, and correspondence that documented the steps he had taken to ensure legality and transparency. He explained the inconsistencies in past enforcement of similar rules, highlighting instances where fines had been reduced or waived. The judge listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Mark felt a surge of confidence as he realized that the focus was not on emotion or personal disagreements, but on facts, evidence, and legal principles. His preparation had paid off. He spoke calmly, confidently, and clearly, knowing that his words needed to convey both reason and responsibility. Witnesses were called from both sides. A few neighbors who had observed the situation firsthand on Mark's behalf, confirming that the fence had been built responsibly, was unobtrusive, and had not blocked general access to the lake. Their statements added weight to Mark's case, demonstrating that the actions he had taken were reasonable and measured. On the other side, HOA witnesses stressed the need for consistency, the importance of rules, and the community's interest in shared access. Their testimony was professional, but it lacked the specific evidence that Mark had prepared so carefully. Throughout the proceedings, Mark noticed subtle shifts in the room. Some neighbors who had previously been unsure about his actions now watched attentively, clearly rooting for a fair outcome. Others, including a few board supporters, maintained polite but skeptical expressions. Mark understood that while the trial was a legal matter, it had also become a story about fairness, integrity, and personal courage within the community. During cross-examination, Mark remained calm, answering questions with clarity and precision. His attorney guided him through difficult points, and together they highlighted the consistency of his actions, the legality of the fence, and the fairness of his request to have the fine rescinded. Each piece of evidence, each witness statement, and each carefully prepared argument reinforced the central message. Mark had acted responsibly and within his rights. The board attempted to argue that the fence had disrupted traditional access, but the judge asked for specific evidence. Without tangible proof of widespread disruption, the argument began to lose strength. Mark's preparation, careful documentation, and clear presentation had turned the tide. It became increasingly clear that the case was not just about a fence or a fine, but about demonstrating fairness, accountability, and adherence to proper procedures. By the end of the day, closing statements were made. The judge thanked both sides for their professionalism and thoroughness, explaining that a decision would follow after careful review of all submitted materials. Mark left the courthouse feeling a sense of relief. He had presented his case clearly, respectfully, and convincingly. The trial had been tense, but he had maintained control over his narrative, showing that preparation, patience, and reason could overcome intimidation and rigid authority. As he walked back to his car, Mark glanced at the lake in the distance, imagining the calm water and the gentle lapping of waves. The trial had been the culmination of weeks of stress, planning, and careful action. Whatever the outcome, he knew he had done everything possible to assert his rights responsibly. The lake had always been a source of peace, and now it also represented resilience, determination, and the quiet power of standing up for oneself in the face of challenge. The wait for the verdict was tense. Mark returned to his lakefront home each morning with a mixture of anticipation and quiet resolve. The fence he had built stood firm, its wooden posts reflecting the sunlight, a reminder of both his determination and the steps he had taken to protect his property. The lake remained as serene as ever, but the peacefulness was now tempered by the knowledge that the community dispute might finally reach its conclusion. When the judge's decision arrived, Mark opened the letter with careful attention. The words confirmed what he had hoped. The fine was overturned. The homeowners' association's claim that the fence had restricted access was not upheld, and the judge emphasized that Mark had acted within his property rights. Furthermore, the decision noted that the HOA's enforcement of rules in similar situations had been inconsistent, giving credence to Mark's argument that the fine had been unfairly applied. Relief washed over him, but it was accompanied by a deep sense of accomplishment. Word of the verdict spread quickly through the neighborhood. Reactions were varied. Some neighbors approached Mark with congratulations, expressing admiration for the way he had handled the situation. They praised his careful planning, patience, and the calm professionalism he had displayed throughout the dispute. Others were more reserved, some choosing to quietly reconsider their views on the HOA's actions. Either way, the community had changed. The event had sparked conversations about fairness, rules, and respect for individual property. The Homeowners Association, while disappointed, acknowledged the ruling without unnecessary confrontation. They announced plans to review and revise certain rules and enforcement procedures, taking steps to prevent similar conflicts in the future. Mark noticed that the tone of board communications became more measured and careful. The victory was not just personal. It had prompted a subtle but meaningful shift in the way the community managed disputes and rules. Mark took some time to reflect on what he had learned. The fine had initially seemed like an insurmountable obstacle, a threat to both his finances and his peace of mind. The conflict had tested his patience, planning, and resilience. He realized that standing up for his rights had required more than knowledge of rules and property lines. It had required courage, careful strategy, and the willingness to act calmly under pressure. The process had been demanding, but the outcome had reaffirmed his belief in fairness and justice. The lakefront mornings returned to a sense of calm that felt earned rather than taken for granted. Mark could fish again, walk along the shoreline, and enjoy the quiet that had first drawn him to the community. Each time he cast his line, he appreciated the freedom to enjoy his property without the looming shadow of fines or disputes. The fence remained as a clear marker of boundaries, but it no longer represented tension or conflict. Instead, it was a reminder of the careful and deliberate steps that had protected both his rights and his peace of mind. Neighbors gradually returned to their usual routines as well. Some who had initially expressed concern about the fence and the dispute approached Mark with cautious camaraderie. They discussed shared interests, garden projects, and lake activities, slowly rebuilding a sense of normalcy. Even those who had sided with the HOA seemed to acknowledge that the process had been conducted fairly and respectfully. Mark recognized that while opinions might differ, mutual respect had survived the conflict, and in some cases, strengthened relationships. Mark's reflection extended beyond the immediate neighborhood. He realized that the experience had taught him valuable lessons about life, communication, and the importance of standing up for one's rights with integrity. He had faced bureaucratic rigidity and community tension, yet he had navigated both with careful planning and calm determination. The outcome was a testament to persistence, preparation, and the power of measured action in resolving disputes. In the quiet evenings, Mark would sit on his porch, looking at the lake and the fence that now symbolized more than a boundary. It was a symbol of resilience, fairness, and the quiet strength required to navigate challenges responsibly. The experience had been difficult, sometimes stressful, but ultimately rewarding. Mark felt a renewed sense of confidence, knowing that he could protect what mattered to him while maintaining respect for others and for the principles that guided his life. The lake remained a place of peace, the fence a marker of boundaries respected, and the neighborhood, though altered by recent events, was returning to its familiar rhythm. Mark had weathered the storm of rules, fines, and legal threats, emerging not just victorious, but wiser. He had learned that challenges could be met with calm determination, that fairness could prevail even in rigid systems, and that standing up for oneself could be done with integrity. The calm of the lake reflected more than sunlight now. It reflected the quiet satisfaction of a man who had faced adversity and navigated it with courage, clarity, and care. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.